On today's episode, I'll share my Blackhawks U23 rankings while Artyom Levshunov receives a surprise call-up.
You're Locked On Blackhawks, your daily podcast on the Chicago Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's going on, Blackhawks fans? Welcome back to another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, I'm your host, Jack Bushman. You can check me out on X at Jack Bushman 2. Actually had someone in the comment section recently ask me, what is X? Twitter, X, whatever they call it these days. That's where you can find me. Quick reminder to go and smash that like button. Jump in the comment section down below as well. Still having Mailbag Monday on today's episode, but only have 3 questions to answer. Definitely want to ramp those puppies up for next week's edition. So if you're watching on YouTube, hit the comment section down below with your Blackhawks related question. And even if you're tuning in through an audio platform, can easily drop your question in the review section, preferably with a 5-star rating. Those are always great. And definitely wanted to shout out to everyone who does already follow Locked On Blackhawks on YouTube for helping me reach my goal of 2,000 subscribers before the month of January came to a close. Super stoked about that. Let's keep those numbers going. Hit that subscribe button if you haven't already. And last but certainly not least, got to give a quick shout out to today's sponsor, which is FanDuel. Go and check out FanDuel.com right now to win $200 worth of bonus bets when your first $5 bet wins at Super Bowl 59. All right, good afternoon, everyone. Again, thank you all for joining me on another episode of Locked On Blackhawks, your one-stop shop for all things Chicago Blackhawks. Hope everyone out there had themselves a wonderful weekend. To open things up on the show here this week, Artyom Levshunov, the second overall pick in the 2024 NHL draft, has officially received his first ever NHL call-up, something I don't think any of us Blackhawks fans anticipated here to kick off our week. But sadly, with Louis Crevier being placed on injured reserve, he was forced to leave Saturday's blowout loss to the Florida Panthers early and is now in concussion protocol while on injured reserve. Not going to be talking very much about that lopsided loss for the Blackhawks to the defending Stanley Cup champions over the weekend, because outside of Landon Slaggert's record-setting goal just 7 seconds into the game, the final 59 minutes and 53 seconds of that contest did not go very good for our Blackhawks. But yeah, Levshunov getting a call up here to kick off the week, not a move I don't think any of us Blackhawks fans saw coming. And even going back to something I touched on a few weeks ago when I followed up on my preseason bold predictions episode that I went back and looked at as the Blackhawks entered the midway point of the season. One of the bold predictions that I gave out was that Artyom Levshunov was not going to make his NHL debut this season, because I fully expected the Blackhawks to keep him marinating and developing down in Rockford, very similarly to what we've seen Ethan Del Mastro go through these last couple of years. Alex Vlasic the year prior. Kevin Korchinski, right, is ripening down in the minor leagues right now as well. Fully expected that to be the case with Levshunov. But quite honestly, Blackhawks fans, this decor as a whole has been very mind-boggling over the last couple of days, because with Louis Crevier still healthy, Connor Murphy also made his return from injured reserve on Saturday against the Panthers. He missed the entire first month of 2025 due to a groin injury, last played on New Year's Eve in the Winter Classic against the St. Louis Blues. So getting Murphy back, and at the time, the Blackhawks hadn't sent anyone back to Rockford, so that left 8 defensemen on their active roster, and I was like, what is going to give here? Well, Crevier winds up on injured reserve. That puts the Blackhawks back at the standard 7 active defensemen on their NHL roster. But then they call up Artyom Levshunov. I'm like, what is going on here? However, a key tidbit in the news of Levshunov being called up is that he's only going to be appearing in Blackhawks practices. He's not going to be making his NHL debut. At least he's not expected to during this current stint. And the reasoning for him getting called up is because with the Rockford IceHogs in the AHL being in the middle of the AHL All-Star break, Levshunov was just going to be sitting around for these couple of days awaiting for the IceHogs to return to action on Friday night. So instead of just having him sit around, Levshunov instead gets called up in order to get some practice time with the NHL guys and the bigger bodies in the organization. I also think it allows Kyle Davidson and all of his front office staff members to get a look at Levshunov competing in practice against bigger bodies and some more capable players to kind of determine and evaluate how his developmental process has been going thus far. So even though it is a little disappointing that we're not going to see Artyom Levshunov, I don't think that's surprising whatsoever. I still really wouldn't expect him to make his NHL debut this year. And if he does, it's probably going to be in a very similar fashion to Ethan Del Mastro last year, where they rewarded him in the final couple games of the season for some really solid play down in Rockford. I feel like that's the only way that Levshunov is going to make his NHL debut this year as well. But I like the idea and the decision to bring him up around the NHL bodies for a few days. And as far as what has Levshunov been up to down with the IceHogs so far this year, as I mentioned, that's where he's been the entire first half and then some of the season so far. 19-year-old defenseman has tallied 13 points, 3 goals and 10 assists through his opening 38 AHL games. Actually just scored a really nice goal over the weekend that was set up by fellow countryman Dmitry Kuzmin, who has finally got his visa situation under order after being acquired in a deal from the Winnipeg Jets that sent Isaac Phillips up to Winnipeg in a change of scenery type of move. I think that was a real smart piece of business by Kyle Davidson, because it's obviously been a lot for Levshunov these last couple of years since coming over to North America, playing in the USHL with Green Bay, then a quick turnaround to Michigan State, quick turnaround to being drafted and making the leap to pro hockey. To have another Belarusian around, someone who he's actually, as I've talked about on the show, trained with in Florida, and they share the same agent in Dan Milstein, I think it makes a lot of sense for many different reasons for the Blackhawks. And Isaac Phillips had just clearly fallen out of the pecking order with so many other defensemen arriving onto the scene. And I know there's been a lot of discourse around Artyom Levshunov, especially considering what Ivan Demidov has been doing over in the KHL. And it's kind of been a roller coaster ride of a first pro season for Artyom Levshunov. But quite honestly, Blackhawks fans, that's what's going to happen for the most part with a 19-year-old defenseman jumping into a grown man's league. And we've seen, the highs from Levshunov. I think he has a really good skating ability, probably not elite or like top tier or anything, but he's a very mobile defenseman for a guy of his size, already 6'3", well over 200 pounds at 19 years old, and can handle himself well in the dirty areas. I think I'd like to see him use his size and play with a little bit more of an edge and a chip on his shoulder from time to time. But we see the raw skills, we see the ability and the willingness to jump up in the rush in transition. Only 3 goals this year, but he scored 9 goals as a freshman for Michigan State last year. And I'm sure with that big body, that's something that the Blackhawks are really working on developing with him down there in Rockford. He's got all the raw skills. It's just kind of about how high is the upside truly going to become for Artyom Levshunov. And that's always really been my sort of debate and my disliking for the Blackhawks taking him second overall. And I hear you, Blackhawks fans. I agree. I would have rather taken Ivan Demidov. I wish Kyle Davidson taken Ivan Demidov. If I was in that situation, that's the guy who I would have taken. But as far as like this bust narrative that's been thrown around Artyom Levshunov, like the kid's only 19 in his first pro season, and he's had a lot of quick turnarounds these last few years. Again, I would have taken Demidov, but we won't truly know what these players are for several years down the road. We won't know if Artyom Levshunov's a bust, which I don't think he will be whatsoever. We won't know the answer to that question down the road. So kind of some of the takes that I've been hearing around Artyom Levshunov, I really don't agree with. And just serving as a reminder here again on this podcast, that we need to be really patient with this kid, because the amount of talent and the amount of skills and really no glaring weakness in his game other than sometimes shoddy decision-making, which again is a very common trait for 19-year-olds in their first pro season. Like there's a lot to like about Artyom Levshunov. Again, it's just to me really about what is the ceiling and what is the upside going to be when he doesn't have that one outstanding like A+ trait or characteristic. But good idea again for the Blackhawks to give him some practice reps with the NHL bodies over the next couple of days. Fully expect Levshunov to be reassigned to Rockford probably on Thursday prior to them returning to action on Friday. Also very interested to see what's going to happen though with the Blackhawks blue line whenever Louis Crevier does return from injured reserve. Hopefully he won't be in concussion protocol for all that long, even though he and Alex Vlasic hadn't really been playing up to the same level that they were when Crevier was first called up over the past couple of weeks. Definitely want to see him get some more action down the stretch of the season because that's the name of the game for the Chicago Blackhawks here in the second half. But whenever Crevier does return, it's going to be interesting to see whether he goes back down to Rockford, whether it's going to be Ethan Del Mastro. Going to be very interested to see who ultimately winds up going back down to Rockford if/when this Blackhawks blue line ever becomes fully healthy. But speaking of Artyom Levshunov and Blackhawks prospects here, before I close out segment 1 on today's episode, Blackhawks fans, I wanted to be sure to go through my Chicago Blackhawks U23 player rankings. Of course, on the show last week, I went through Corey Pronman's top 150 U23 players in the NHL and talked about where certain Blackhawks came in at that list, how Pronman had them ranked, and also some thoughts of his on each player's particular skill sets. I hinted in that episode when going through all of it, I would be here soon going through my own Blackhawks U23 player rankings. So without any further ado, let's go ahead and get into it. Just a reminder though, quickly, Blackhawks fans, this is where Corey Pronman had Blackhawks prospects ranked inside his top 150. Connor Bedard came in at number 3, which I think is absolutely criminal. I could understand, having him at number 2 behind Macklin Celebrini, but to have him behind Tim Stützle, I think is an absolute disservice. It's Macklin and Connor 1 and 2, however you want to go about it. That's fine, but to me, those are the clear-cut top 2. Then he had Artyom Levshunov next at number 22, Kevin Korchinski at 66, Sam Rinzel right behind him at 67, then Kanserov at 73, Boisvert at 89, Moore at 91, Lucas Reichel at 128, and Colton Dach rounding things out at 132. Of course, no Frank Nazar in the top 150, according to Corey Pronman. So maybe take some of these rankings with a grain of salt. But as I referenced when I first broke down his rankings, as someone who covers just one NHL team, it's very hard to keep in mind the prospect pools and rankings of each of the other 31 NHL clubs. So definitely going to cut Corey Pronman a little bit of slack here. But as far as my top 15 Blackhawks U23 player rankings, of course, at number 1, I have Connor Bedard. As I mentioned, I'd have him at number 2 if I was ranking the entire league. The second Blackhawks player that I have coming in under the age of 23 is Frank Nazar, the man that Pronman left off of his list completely, which literally has my jaw on the floor. Of course, you Blackhawks fans who have been watching along or listening to this show for a while know I think the world of Frank the Tank Nazar. There's a reason he came in at number 1 in my midseason prospect rankings. I have Nazar right behind Connor Bedard, and I honestly have him ahead of Artyom Levshunov. I think he has the higher ceiling of the two players. I do still have Levshunov coming in at 3, though. As I mentioned, he has all the raw tools. He's still only 19. There's no glaring weakness. And yeah, it's been a little bit of a roller coaster ride first pro season for him. But again, the type of dominant year that he had with Michigan State last year as a freshman, it was more dominant than what Sam Rinzel is doing with Minnesota right now. Rinzel also is a sophomore and has a much more talented team. So that's why I have Levshunov at 3, but behind Nazar. Ahead of Sam Rinzel, though, who I also have ahead of Kevin Korchinski. I have Rinzel at 3. Pronman had Korchinski at 66 in his top 50, then Rinzel right behind him at 67. I actually have Sam Rinzel narrowing out Kevin Korchinski because, quite honestly, I think they're very similar in the way they play the game. Korchinski has the better speed, but I think Rinzel, with the bigger body at 6'4", he's got a little bit more meat on the bone compared to Korchinski. I think neither of those two players are ever going to be stud defensive players. They're going to be known for their puck moving abilities, both with skating and in their passing, their offensive game, the dynamic abilities in the offensive zone. I think that's both of those guys' forte. But I think Sam Rinzel is the younger of the two players, of course, and also has the frame to succeed more in the defensive zone against grown men. So that's why I have Rinzel at 3. I think he probably has a little bit higher runway as well and shapes up to be the more stable two-way player. So I have him at 3, narrowly edging out Kevin Korchinski, who, again, still only 20 years old. There's a lot of runway for this kid. Has done some good things at the AHL level, got into the AHL All-Star game. Very excited to see him perform in that in the next couple of days. I have Korch at number 4. I have Sasha Boisvert coming in at number 5. Corey Pronman, had him below Roman Kanserov. I have Sasha a little bit ahead of Kanserov just because of his compete level. And as I talked about when breaking down Pronman's list, I think the goal scoring ability, maybe I'm higher on that aspect of Sasha's game compared to others, but I think he could be a high-end goal scorer at the next level. And I know he's got outstanding work ethic and some really good size, plays a solid two-way game. That's why I have Sasha at 5, but I do have Kanserov right behind him at number 6. And I think Kanserov probably has the higher ceiling of the two players given his foot speed, and I think he has the more well-rounded offensive nature in terms of goal scoring and passing. Sasha's shot is the best weapon for both of those two players, but Kanserov, very dynamic offensive makeup. A little bit undersized, though. I think that goes into it as well. That's why I have him at number 6. But I think both he and Boisvert have top 6 upside. I have Oliver Moore coming in next at number 7, who is clearly, to me, behind both Boisvert and Roman Kanserov. Obviously, it's all about the foot speed for Oliver Moore. He's the fastest of those three skaters, but he doesn't have the full, well-rounded game like either of them do. I don't think he has a very good shot. I don't really see him being much of a goal scorer at the next level, but I also think he's probably the better defensive-minded forward of that group. Really good motor, really good work ethic, a true center iceman who's going to make an impact in all three zones. So Oliver Moore, I think, is more set up to be the third-line center of the future for the Blackhawks, whereas Boisvert and Kanserov, have top 6 upside. But I definitely still think Oliver Moore is going to be a good NHL player that can play on the power play too, the penalty kill, very diverse skill set. At number 8, a guy that Corey Pronman didn't have in his top 150 entirely, Drew Commesso, who, it's been a little bumpy in terms of his sophomore pro season, but kind of similar to what Arvid Soderblom was going through last year when he had to get called up and go back down to Rockford time and time again because of injuries. And Comesso's kind of gotten back into his groove over these last couple of weeks. He's been high on my prospect ranking for years, racked up tons of good experience, and I think he's just as likely to be the goaltender of the future for the Chicago Blackhawks as Arvid Soderblom is. Even though we've seen some incredible things out of Soderblom as of late, remember, just 7 months ago, people didn't even think Arvid Soderblom was an NHL goaltender. At number 9 for me, another player who didn't even, at number 10, forgot to bump all of these guys down. At number 10, rounding out my top 10, is Nick Lardis, who wasn't in the top 150 for Corey Pronman either, which is crazy to me for a guy who's the top goal scorer in the entire CHL. Just had a 4-goal game over the weekend. All Nick Lardis does is score goals. Now, I've talked about whether that's translatable to the next level or not. I don't know for sure, but the upside is absolutely undoubtable. I really like the playmaking developments he's had over the last year or so. Super excited to see what kind of numbers Nick Lardis is going to put up in the O when it's all said and done. At number 11, I have his Brantford Bulldog teammate, first-round pick for the Blackhawks this past year, and Marek Vanacker. Kind of a slow start to the season for him, but he did miss the early portion of the year while rehabbing from shoulder injury, didn't really have much of an offseason, and has started to pick up his production here as of late. Back-to-back 2-goal games for him over the weekend. Dynamic skill set offensively as well, with some good foot speed. I don't think he has the true special skill sets like Kanserov or Boisvert, but Marek Vanacker could be a middle 6 good offensive-minded winger for the Blackhawks down the road. At number 11, I have Lukas Reichel, who we've seen some blips from this year, a lot of better consistency over the last couple of weeks as he's finally gotten elevated inside the Blackhawks lineup. I don't think he quite has the upside of, Sasha Boisvert, Roman Kanserov, Nick Lardis, or Marek Vanacker even at this point in time, considering what we've seen from Reichel, but the foot speed is undeniable. I don't know if he's ever going to put it together to be a well enough finished product to have top 6 upside, and that's why I do have him behind guys like Lardis and Vanacker who do still have that possibility. But I think Lukas Reichel, with his speed and some of the confidence that he's gotten in himself these last few weeks, and also how he's kind of gotten a little bit more rugged and reliable on the defensive side of things, maybe this putting him in the bottom 6 has kind of worked. We'll see what he kind of turns into the rest of the year and moving forward, but I'm not giving up on Lukas Reichel. Still have him at 11. I have Ethan Del Mastro next at number 12 up in the NHL. At this point with the Blackhawks, could be going back down to Rockford though here soon, but I've been pretty happy with what I've seen from Del Mastro in this current NHL stint. I like his aggressiveness, his willingness to jump up in rushes. I think he has the higher offensive upside between he and Nolan Allen, something I've talked about several times. Maybe isn't as sturdy or consistent in the defensive zone. He is capable of making a mistake from time to time, but another guy with some really good size who has had some nice development in the offensive game over these last couple of seasons, and I think could be a third pairing puzzle piece for the Blackhawks. So I have Del Mastro at number 13. I have Wyatt Kaiser right behind him at number 14. And honestly, these guys, they're splitting hairs because I think I do like Wyatt Kaiser's skill set better than Ethan Del Mastro's, but I like Ethan Del Mastro's frame to have success in the defensive zone better than Wyatt Kaiser's. They're both very similar. I gave Ethan Del Mastro a little bit of an edge because he's the younger of the two players. And then rounding things out at number 15, Blackhawks fans, guy who is on the NHL scene with the Hawks right now in his first NHL stint, Colton Dach. I don't quite think he will ever have that true top six upside because the foot speed and the playmaking just isn't there, but has a very unique and different and quite honestly much needed skill set in this Blackhawks forward group. A big body, a guy who crashes the net, wants to put the puck on cage, gets physical. Love all the stuff that Colton Dach has been doing, and I really think the Blackhawks should be giving him more opportunities regularly on the third line in the second half of the season. But there are my Blackhawks top 15 U23 player rankings, comparing them to Corey Pronman's top 150 that he dropped here recently, as well as Artyom Levshunov receiving a brief and surprising NHL call-up. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, I'll talk about what an increased salary cap can mean for this Blackhawks rebuild. But first, I got to talk to you all about the fine folks over at FanDuel. Super Bowl 59 is now less than 1 week away. One game, two teams, and endless possibilities. And there's no better way to make every play more exciting, than with the FanDuel Sportsbook. Because whether it's predicting the first touchdown, calling the MVP, or even betting on the coin toss, FanDuel makes it so easy to get in on the action. With live betting all game long, you can now adjust your bets as the game unfolds and feel the thrill from kickoff up until the final whistle. And the live betting feature also lets you stay involved no matter what happens on the field, and the app is super easy for you to navigate. Plus, knowing that you can place down just a $5 bet and potentially win $200 worth of bonus bets for the Super Bowl, that's the icing on the cake. So make sure to go and download the app or head on over to FanDuel.com to go and get started today. Bet just $5 again, and if you win, you'll score $200 worth of bonus bets. Again, that's FanDuel.com to go and bet with FanDuel, the official partner of Super Bowl 59. Segment 2, on Friday morning, a huge news bomb broke from the NHL and NHLPA regarding the salary cap for future seasons. Very good news for us Chicago Blackhawks fans. For those of you who don't know what I'm talking about or don't even know what the salary cap numbers are for this season, to set the scene here, ever since COVID, and quite honestly, ever since, I've been involved in hockey, and my fandom really started in the early 2000s. Patrick Kane, Jonathan Toews rookie year, my first Blackhawks game. But really, during the golden age for the Blackhawks and the dynasty days, they were, of course, right up against the salary cap. Most competitive teams in the NHL for the last 5, 6, several seasons have been right up against the salary cap, but it's gotten even worse ever since COVID because the NHL salary cap just has not been incrementally growing. And for this season, it's at $88 million, which is up from the $83.5 million, $4.5 million increase from what it was during the 2023-2024 season. But there are still a ton of teams who are super financially strapped, but it looks like there's going to be a lot of salary cap relief coming to the NHL starting next season. The piece of news that was dropped from the NHL and NHLPA involved cap projections for 2025-26, 26-27, and 27-28. Again, the salary cap upper limit right now is $88 million for all 32 NHL teams. For next year, the projection is for the salary cap to go up to $95.5 million. That would be a pretty incremental $7.5 million raise in the salary cap. But then, in the 2026-2027 season, the projection is for the salary cap to go all the way up to $104 million. That's, again, another $8.5 million leap from the season prior, and compared to the 2023-2024 season, as I just mentioned, that's last year the cap was at $83.5 million. By the end of 2026-27, they're projecting it to be up to $104 million, over $20 million growth in just a couple of seasons. But we're not done. By the end of the 2027-2028 season, the salary cap is projected to go all the way up to $113.5 million, up another $9.5 million from the season prior. So again, right now the salary cap is $88 million. According to my math, $25.5 million. I believe that would be correct. Journalism math here as a reminder. But yes, $25.5 million is what the salary cap is expected to go up from right here, right now, by the start of the 2027-28 year. In total, $25.5 million in 3 years' time. Super notable, especially for us Chicago Blackhawks fans. What does this mean for the Chicago Blackhawks rebuild? It's mostly great news, because the Blackhawks don't have a ton of money tied up long-term to very many players. They actually only have a projected $60 million on their books for next year, and then have less than $26 million tied up in both 2026-27 and 27-28. So there's going to be lots of wiggle room for the Chicago Blackhawks to work with. And I'm sure some of you remember, I think it was the episode that I dropped on Friday last week. You remember when I said how acquiring Anders Lee, taking on his $7.5 million contract through the end of next season, that would be affordable for the Blackhawks, considering Connor Bedard would be on the end of his entry-level deal. But you have to wonder how that would impact them potentially signing a Mikko Rantanen or a Mitch Marner in the offseason, a guy who's probably going to command $14 million a year. Yes, over long term, the Blackhawks certainly can afford it, but you got to consider what that would mean on the books for them next season still, and whether that would take them out of the superstar market in the summer of 2025. Well, I don't really think that would be much of a worry for the Chicago Blackhawks. The one thing you do got to consider, though, is because there's going to be this huge increase in the cap over the next few years, maybe someone like Mikko Rantanen now is going to command more money on the open books. Maybe Mitch Marner is going to command more money on the open market, and that also could lead for some more teams who didn't initially anticipate to be in the running for either of these two guys suddenly are like, oh my gosh, we can afford this. Now we're in the mix. And that can be, that could lead to potentially more attractive teams than the Chicago Blackhawks potentially being in the mix for one of those two guys. And as far as the attractiveness of the Chicago Blackhawks, with all of the salary cap space, that's obviously going to be super attractive. And there's kind of been a debate among Blackhawks Twitter here recently whether or not the Hawks will be an attractive free agent spot. And I know, listen, they've been at the bottom of the standings the last handful of years, but the truth of the matter is this is still an Original Six franchise in a great sports city, an organization that, yes, I know the Kyle Beach stuff obviously happened, but they are still known as a classy organization that treats its players very well and has some really good amenities. They have good facilities for the most part, and they're upgrading facilities in Chicago. A lot of people like to raise families in the Chicagoland area. It is still a very attractive market, even if the team has been doing a lot of losing. And then there's Connor Bedard and this prospect pool. Yes, it might take a little bit. And I'm not saying it's the most attractive free agent destination out there, but I don't think it's as unattractive as some people kind of make it out to be. But I certainly think this means good things for the Chicago Blackhawks. And we've heard Kyle Davidson recently when he talked with the media, like it sure sounds like he's wanting to make a run after a superstar, whether it's in the free agent market this summer or through a trade in the offseason or at the trade deadline this year. And knowing that the salary cap is going to go up this much in the next few years, I think that gives the Blackhawks that many more options. And another thing to consider, Blackhawks fans, I still think the Seth Jones contract is very complicated to trade because of his no movement clause and the amount of term on that deal. But it certainly is more tradable now, considering what the NHL cap upper limit is going to be in a couple of years, because by 2028, Seth Jones's AAV is only going to take up 8% of a full team's cap hit. So it's really not all that bad down the road. I still think, again, there are some complications in order to trade Seth Jones, but it's not as complicated knowing that all of these teams are going to be having some much more cap relief coming in the future. Also, I think what's noteworthy here is the hiring of Chris O'Hearn along with Kyle Davidson, a guy who's known as a numbers cruncher, very familiar with the CBA and contract negotiations and all that stuff. Even though the Blackhawks are now going to have more wiggle room in terms of the cap, they still have to go about it the right way. They still got to be very effective with Connor Bedard's next contract. Whichever superstar and whenever they do wind up landing him, they have to make sure they give out a proper contract with that. And I think having an experienced contract negotiator and front office member like Chris O'Hearn right alongside a first-time general manager and Kyle Davidson, who might have given out a little bit too much money in his first noteworthy offseason last year. I think it was smart to bring in a savvy business guy like Chris O'Hearn to help alongside him crunching the numbers. But there are my thoughts on a very noteworthy increment in the salary cap expected to go up these next couple of years and what it could mean for the Chicago Blackhawks and their rebuild. Coming up in just a moment here, Blackhawks fans, before I close out today's episode, still got to get into our weekly Mailbag Monday fan segment. Back here on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. As always, just wanted to say thank you to everyone for making Locked On Blackhawks your very first listen here to start off your week. Now, for your second listen, make sure to go and check out the Locked On Fantasy Hockey Podcast so that you can get fantasy hockey updates and get the latest news and tidbits from Steal and Flip. That way you can become a fantasy hockey expert and get the edge over your league mates down the stretch of the season. You can easily find the link to Locked On Fantasy Hockey on YouTube or wherever you may be listening to your podcasts. Segment 3, per usual, Mailbag Monday, but as I mentioned earlier, only a couple of questions. Please, if you're watching at this point in today's episode and you got a Blackhawks-related question, reach out in the comment section. If you're listening through an audio platform, drop your cue in the review section, or you can also email lockdownblackhawks@gmail.com or hit me up on any one of my social media accounts. Definitely want to pump those numbers up for next week's edition of Mailbag Monday. First question I wanted to get to today, though, comes from Isaac Guerrero 8873 on YouTube. Isaac actually asked 2 of the 3 questions this week. The first one, though, was, do your sources indicate at all if the Blackhawks have even offered Ryan Donato a new deal? And I did reach out to a couple of people about this, Isaac. I didn't get any official confirmation, but from what I've heard, there has not been an offer to Ryan Donato at this point in time for a contract extension. And while I do think like he fits the mold of a good veteran that a lot of these young forwards can learn from, and he plays the game the right way, and while the Blackhawks also don't necessarily need the asset that he would command in the trade market, I do think the rest of the year is just going to be about getting kids opportunities. And what I've said on the pod before is it's clear the Blackhawks just have 1 or 2 forwards too many. They're kind of clogging up spots, and we're seeing, Colton Dach gets scratched. Landon Slaggert, he's got to be playing on a regular basis. I think, clearing out Ryan Donato and maybe one of Pat Maroon or Craig Smith is probably going to happen at the deadline just for a sheer numbers perspective. And also, I think Ryan Donato kind of deserves an opportunity to go and play a big role for a team contending for a Stanley Cup. I don't know if that's what he wants exactly, but I would expect more likely than not that Ryan Donato is going to get dealt at the deadline. Don't think the Blackhawks are going to give him an extension, as he's just their most attractive trade piece left on the roster. Next question that Isaac asked was, the Cats scored 65 goals, 127 points in 62 games in championship Erie Otters season. He was a light, shorter player and a second-round draft choice. What is your NHL comparable to project for Nick Lardis? Yeah, very interesting, and I talked about Lardis in segment 1. The leading goal scorer in the entire CHL. The kid can absolutely light it up, and he's been making some strides in his game. I said the playmaking. He's added some weight to his bone. Also, I think Scott Powers of The Athletic had a really good article on Nick Lardis come out recently in terms of some of the things he's trying to doing to make sure this translate over to the next level, and doesn't have some of those concerns about his defensive nature and his ability away from the puck. Listen, I think Nick Lardis can absolutely be a 30-goal scorer at the next level. Am I going to guarantee it's going to happen? Am I going to put him in my top 5 prospect rankings? No, because quite honestly, I just kind of need to see it before it happens. And we've seen many short players who have been doubted throughout their journeys in junior hockey or whatever it may be, go on to the NHL level and have success. But that doesn't mean it's absolutely going to happen to Nick Lardis. I definitely think it can, and it definitely has top 6 upside. But for me to project Nick Lardis to someone yeah, he could be Alex DeBrincat, but he also could be someone who winds up being a tweener and never really figures it out. To be fair, I think he has looked good in preseason action in some of the games that he's gotten against bigger bodies. But again, that's preseason hockey where most of the vets he's playing are just trying to get some reps in before the regular season actually starts. If you want me to guess right here, right now, though, Isaac, and the rest of all you Blackhawks fans, if I had to guess right here, right now, whether Nick Lardis will figure it out and become a good NHL player or not, I would guess he does. Last question I wanted to get to on the episode here today, though, comes from Sedker23485, who emailed in the podcast and asked, which young defenseman do you think is most expendable? Seems like we have too many for our own good and not enough high-level forward prospects. Think a swap happens at some point, Jack? And I think this is a really good point. Again, why I would have taken Ivan Demidov, just because of the sheer number of defensemen the Blackhawks have in their system. The ones who kind of seem like the odd men out to me at this point would be Wyatt Kaiser and Ethan Del Mastro. Those are kind of the two odd men out. I do also wonder if Kevin Korchinski could be expendable at some point in time, because as I mentioned earlier, Sam Renzel is a guy who provides a lot of similar things to Kevin Korchinski, not the same speed upside, which again is probably the most attractive asset that Korchinski has and why I wouldn't quit on him. But I do wonder if Kyle Davidson's ever thought about trading Korchinski if the offer was sweet enough, just because they could use another high-end forward prospect, and they have a lot of good young defensemen who, kind of have fit that mold, have bigger bodies, and maybe can handle themselves in the defensive zone a little bit better than Korchinski, while also still providing offense. A very fascinating question, but I do think at some point in time, one of these guys is going to be on the move. To me, though, it's probably going to be Ethan Del Mastro or Wyatt Kaiser. But that's going to close out today's episode of Locked On Blackhawks. As always, thank you all again for joining me on the show. Be sure to go and follow Locked On Blackhawks for free wherever you may be listening to your podcast. And if you haven't done so already, smash that subscribe button. Help me on the climb to 3,000 subscribers. And also that way you can get the latest episode as soon as it's uploaded to YouTube each and every day. Until next time, everyone, have a great rest of your Mondays. I'll see you next time on the Locked On Blackhawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.